The term unbiblical gets tossed around in doctrinal and ecclesiastical disputes of every kind, from Protestant critiques of Catholic and Eastern Orthodox teaching to the intramural fights within Protestantism itself, even in disputes within individual denominations. That's unbiblical functions like a trump card. Go straight back to the text. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. Since sola scriptura drives most Protestant approaches, the charge at face value carries real weight. It recenters the debate on our common denominator, the 66-book Protestant canon. And that isn't outright a bad thing. A productive argument needs shared ground. Otherwise, we just talk past each other. If both sides agree on the court of appeal, we can actually test which system holds together logically, philosophically, historically, theologically, and yes, scripturally. To put this in perspective, imagine a Christian debating an atheist about whether anger or hatred or ill will toward one's brother is wrong. Quoting Jesus' words of, "Whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment" in Matthew 5:22 and "Love your enemies" in Matthew 5:44 won't persuade someone who denies Jesus' divine authority. In their eyes, he might be a moral teacher, a famous carpenter, or perhaps a deluded but otherwise solid fellow, but not the voice of God. So in this instance, his words carry little to no weight when it comes to the debate at hand. Arguments are rarely convincing when they stand on ground the other side doesn't share. To argue your position effectively, you need to find common ground and build your case from there. In the aforementioned scenario, the atheist may rightly point out that your point does not stand as you are appealing to ground he or she does not accept as valid. And that's exactly what's happening in the charge. That's unbiblical. It claims your position has stepped off the common foundation and onto fringe ground, losing its footing in the shared source both sides acknowledge as legitimate. In practice, it's shorthand for, your view is unreliable because it cannot stand within the text we both accept. At face value, it's a heavy charge indeed. The only problem is that it loses its rhetorical weight upon further inspection. The claim is that their opponent has stepped off common ground, but different traditions have different understandings of the scope of common ground. So unbiblical can vary vastly in meaning across the spectrum of beliefs in this regard. Some traditions restrict it to what Scripture explicitly states. Others include what follows by good and necessary consequence. Others allow adiaphora, things indifferent, so long as the gospel isn't obscured. Still others judge by Scripture's moral trajectory. Today I want to briefly examine the metaphysics, the underlying rules of authority and inference at work in That's Unbiblical, and then walk through how each tradition actually draws that line. On one end of the spectrum are the explicit-only biblicists. Think fundamentalists, many independent Baptists, and restorationists. For them, unbiblical means not plainly taught or modeled in the New Testament. So according to this view, if you can't put your finger on chapter and verse, it's a human invention. Their unofficial motto in this regard is, where the Bible speaks, we speak. Where the Bible is silent, we are silent. According to this view, creeds feel risky, liturgical embellishments feel suspect, and practices without a clear New Testament blueprint are treated as stepping off common ground. Step a bit toward the center of the spectrum, and you'll find the confessional, Reformed, or Presbyterian world. Here, unbiblical doesn't mean not mentioned, but rather neither taught nor necessarily inferred. The Westminster Confession's language of good and necessary consequence is decisive. If a doctrine truly follows from Scripture's teaching, it can be counted as biblical. And to be clear, our Reformed brethren point to their confessions in church courts as a check against pure individualism. But this raises the deeper historical question. By what authority was a new confession established in the 16th century that could stand apart from the ecumenical consensus of the entire church for the preceding 1500 years? At best, the issue shifts from a private person to a private tradition. For worship, Reformed churches follow the regulative principle that divine command authorizes and human invention doesn't. Their overall working definition of biblical would be that which Scripture teaches, explicitly or by good and necessary consequence. In short, inference matters, but so do guardrails. Close by are the Lutherans. In Lutheran circles, Scripture reigns, and silence yields liberty. Under adiaphora, what's unbiblical is what opposes the word or casts a shadow over the gospel. The Lutheran understanding of that which is biblical could be summarized as follows: neither commanded nor forbidden, then free, so long as the gospel is not obscured. Next up is Anglicans and Episcopalians, who insist Scripture is primary but read within steadying hands of tradition and reason. They'll say Scripture contains all things necessary to salvation, which is not the same as contains every procedural detail for church life. Hence, the practical maxim is Scripture, tradition, reason. Unbiblical in this sense means contrary to Scripture rightly interpreted with the church's memory and sanctified judgment, which naturally begs the question, who decides which of the many possible interpretations of Scripture is correct? But more on that later. In Wesleyan and Methodist circles, a fourth joins the Anglican trio, and that is experience, not as a rival to Scripture, but as a check on blind spots and a witness to the Spirit's work. Scripture remains first, with tradition, reason, and experience helping us read it well. A commonly quoted ethos in this view is, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. In this view, unbiblical means that which is against Scripture's plain teaching or out of tune with its gospel trajectory of holy love. Further along the spectrum, we enter the bustling world of Pentecostal, charismatic, and many charismatically inclined non-denominational evangelicals. The watchword here is immediacy, gifts, guidance, and mission. The canon is closed, but the Spirit is not. Their rule of thumb is the Spirit never contradicts the Word. Thus, unbiblical means either classing with Scripture or dismissing gifts and ministries that Scripture itself anticipates, with the book of Acts and 1 Corinthians 12-14 as frequent touchstones. Creeds and structures are welcomed insofar as they serve the Word's life and the Church's mission. When they harden into obstacles, they're treated as out of step with Scripture's aims. Openness to Spirit-led ministry takes priority over heavy formalism. Take a quieter path and you'll arrive among the Anabaptists and historic peace churches like the Mennonites and Amish. Their hermeneutical compass is explicitly Christocentric. They read all Scripture through the Sermon on the Mount and the way of the cross. Unbiblical in this view is anything out of step with Jesus' plain commands. Enemy love, truth-telling, and non-coercion. A fitting motto for this view would be, Jesus is the norm of Scripture. Finally, at the far end of the spectrum, you'll encounter progressive or mainline hermeneutics across various denominations. Scripture is revered as inspired yet historically situated. Authority concentrates on the gospel's moral trajectory of justice, mercy, and Christ-like love. Unbiblical in this register means contrary to where Scripture is pointing. The emblematic refrain is, God is still speaking. Development is judged faithful when it embodies the Bible's deepest arc rather than what would be considered its time-bound scaffolding. All in all, same word, same Bible, yet 8 different rule books and definitions, 8 different implications in the charge. That's unbiblical, the force of which depends entirely on the premises set for what is considered biblical. If we step outside the Reformation frame and ask how the historic church adjudicated these disputes, the landscape looks rather different. The church began with an apostolic deposit, not a DIY reading club. Scripture was read inside the rule of faith, received, prayed, confessed, and guarded. The 16th century Protestant redefinition of the rule of faith, sola scriptura, reverses the order. The Bible is the sole infallible rule and everything else is advisory. This view holds that no binding universal court remains to decide betwixt contested readings. For more on this subject, check out episode number 7 titled Take Me to Your Leader. In the historic or apostolic framework, biblical means in continuity with the apostolic teaching, received by the whole church, confirmed in council, and never at odds with the written word. And the immediate objection to this is, of course, the aforementioned late arriving formulation of sola scriptura, formally articulated over 1,500 years after Christ's death and resurrection. Under sola scriptura, one might ask, but shouldn't we judge the church and its traditions by the Bible alone? But this runs into a problem. The Bible did not fall from the sky with a divinely inspired table of contents, and until the canon is publicly identified, the Bible alone framework cannot even tell you what makes up the Bible, as identifying a table of contents is not a task Scripture performs by itself. The good book itself is a product of the very apostolic tradition it describes. It is a witness to the faith, but the rule of faith is the key that unlocks it. You cannot use the Bible to reject the church that gave you the book in the first place, for on what grounds would you even trust its contents? For the sake of time, I won't get into the arguments regarding the canon. Check out episode 5, The Pointer Finger Problem, where I briefly delve into the problem of the canon under sola scriptura, as well as episodes 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9, where I discuss other areas of strain in regards to sola scriptura. Needless to say, I've written a great deal on the subject, so if you're interested, I'll refer you to those prior episodes, and rest assured there's more on the way, as I feel I've only but scratched the surface on the topic. But at any rate, I digress for now, so let's get back to the subject at hand. There's 4 parameters by which historic or apostolic Christianity determines whether something is considered biblical. The first is apostolicity. The faith is what the apostles handed on, through Scripture and living teaching. That's why realities like Trinity and homoousios are called biblical, not because one verse says everything, but because the church binds together the many texts into the apostolic sense those texts entail. Secondly, Catholicity, or consensus. What has been believed everywhere, always and by all, keeps development organic. Councils don't invent new doctrines. They recognize what the church already prays and teaches. Third is conciliar judgment. When readings clash, ecumenical councils provide a transpersonal decision. After Nicaea or Chalcedon, Scripture is not smaller or constrained in any negative way. It is stabilized against, to put it lightly, private systems, or to put it bluntly, heresies. And finally, liturgical reception. The church believes as she worships. The church's worship is her long memory. Baptismal formulas, Eucharistic prayers, feasts, etc., these bind exegesis to the church's lived confession. Now, I invite you to notice how the framework of the historic or apostolic church's rule of faith provides the counterbalance to each of the Protestant schools of thought. These historic parameters don't erase Protestant insights, they provide stability as they right the boat, so to speak. To the explicit-only biblicist, the church says, silence is not prohibition when the rule of faith requires what Scripture implies. After all, the canon itself was recognized this way, by apostolic usage, not by a proof text about the table of contents. To the Reformed method of deduction, the church adds a guardrail, that good and necessary consequence is tested ecclesially, by creed, council, and consensus, so conclusions don't outrun apostolic reception. To the Lutheran understanding of adiaphora, the Church clarifies the tiers. Dogma cannot be traded, doctrine binds with authority, discipline can change. Freedom exists, but within ordered ranks. And to the Anglican Big Three, Scripture, tradition, and reason, the Church supplies the answer to the logical question: who ultimately decides? Conciliar judgment and a living magisterium keep the three-legged stool from wobbling when reason and fragments of tradition disagree. And regarding the Wesleyan or Methodist formulation, which includes experience, the Church says yes, holiness is a form of truth, but experience is normed by the saints' tested life and the sacramental economy, not by private illumination. And to Pentecostal immediacy, she grants, the Spirit is present, the canon is closed. Discernment of spirits is real, but public and measured against Scripture as read with the Fathers and the whole Church, lest the Spirit told me outrank the Spirit-breathed Word. And to Anabaptist Christ-centrism, she reveals, Christ is the center in the fullness of revelation. He fulfills and thus illuminates the law, prophets, and the rest of Scripture. He indeed leads the ensemble, but he isn't a solo act that makes the rest of Scripture inaudible. And to mainline progressive trajectory readings, she affirms growth while binding it to the deposit. Genuine development unfolds. It does not invert what Scripture and Creed teach. The force of that's unbiblical is dependent upon a prior rule of judgment as to what is or isn't in the first place biblical. Without an actual public authority, the charge collapses into my method of determining what is or isn't biblical versus yours, which is a private verdict pretending to be a universal law. To state the logic explicitly, private methods produce private verdicts. That's unbiblical is a verdict. Therefore, unless it is tested by apostolicity, Catholicity, conciliar judgment, and liturgical reception, that's unbiblical is non-binding rhetoric, a personal persuasion which renders the statement effectively powerless in absolving disputes. The historic Church offers something more than private verdicts and opinions, a shared rule by which Scripture is received, read, taught, and defended. Apostolicity, Catholicity, conciliar judgment, and liturgical reception. That framework doesn't muzzle the Bible. It stabilizes it against thousands, if not millions, of self-appointed tribunals. Authority is not identical with citation. Competing readings require an adjudicator. If the standard is merely my interpretation, the verdict has no public force. It's a private method, therefore a private verdict, which is essentially a DIY wannabe magisterium, or to put it in another way, hermeneutics cosplaying as authority. The historic parameters supply exactly what the charge, that's unbiblical, lacks: a public judge. An answer to the questions, unbiblical, by what rule or by what authority? Apostolicity guards continuity with the deposit. Catholicity checks parochial novelty against the Church's universal memory. Conciliar judgment renders a transpersonal decision that outlives us. Liturgical reception ensures the Church actually prays what she claims to believe. Inside that courtroom, so to speak, that's unbiblical can function as a judgment. Outside of that, it's just an opinion investments. Jettison the living tradition, and the definition of what is biblical dissolves into personal preference, a private verdict with no real weight. So before you can rightly say that's unbiblical, one must define unbiblical. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.